The Supreme Court cleared the way for prosecutors in New York to obtain 8 years of Donald Trump's tax returns, a move that MSNBC reports will allow the New York grand jury to see Trump's tax returns, quote, almost immediately.
The Trump fired back at the court's decision. In a lengthy statement, you say the ruling is a continuation of a political witch hunt that just never ends. And Democratic strategist, maestro himself, Roger Fisk, and senior director of policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard, they join us now to discuss. Roger, let me start with you. The Trump tax returns thing was a long-held wish of a lot of the Democratic establishment and more. Given the New York Times story before the election as well, how do you think about these general investigations and more of Trump as he's out of office, and whether this is the best way to continue and or move on, as somebody like Biden, I suspect, might want to do?
Well, first off, good morning, and it's wonderful to be with you and to join Rachel as well. Once an investigation is underway, it can't just necessarily stop because the president lost or something like that. I think, ultimately he's the architect of these situations. If you're going to pay off porn stars, for example, and then try to claim that as a business expense, you should expect that someone's going to come knocking on your door and want to talk to you about it at some point. That said, I don't think this is necessarily going to move anyone or change anyone's, perception or support of the president. I think Tony Fabrizio's postmortem after the election really nailed it, which is that COVID really crystallized kind of the incompetence and the dishonesty that we saw from the Trump administration, much more so than one of these issues. If something like this was going to move people, it would have moved them 6 or 8 or 10 years ago, because I think it was obvious that he was always kind of playing the margins on these things. The last thing is it shines a light on a very interesting kind of moral dynamic, which is just because something is wrong, claiming that payoff as a business expense, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that it's illegal. So we'll have to see how this plays out.
Yeah, and just Rachel, to give people some context into what is being probed here from Cyrus Vance's office. Per the New York Times, they've issued subpoenas, conducted interviews, scrutinizing a variety of financial matters, including whether the Trump organization misrepresented the value of assets when obtaining loans or paying property taxes, as well as that payment that Roger keeps referencing of the $130,000 in hush money to Stephanie Clifford. One of the dynamics here, too, Rachel, that I think about is the data shows you are much more likely to face consequences and be the subject of an audit if you are a poor working class person than if you are a wealthy person. And yet wealthy people are the ones that cheat on their taxes disproportionately. Part of what Donald Trump is facing is the fact that he's basically had his wealthy elite card pulled by society. And so now he's facing the scrutiny that an ordinary working class person would face if they tried to pull some of the tricks that he's pulled in his taxes.
Well, I think that's partially true, but I would also point out this is not the only lawsuit that he's facing. I mean, he's facing actions across the country. Congressman Richie Neal basically said the legislature is still going to try to get a hold of his tax returns, which I think is inappropriate, right? Criminal proceedings are slightly different than I think the legislature going after someone who is now a private citizen. But I think your overall point stands, and I think that's where people are going to see a little bit of a difference here, because at some point it just starts to feel like wasted time when Jeff Bezos is still going to pay no taxes. Well, hey, at least we're going to try to prove Donald Trump, avoided some. So at some point, I think you run out of gas here. Now, everybody should be held accountable if they've done something wrong. And I think New York State is going to make sure Donald Trump is. But to your broader point, the 1% does this all the time. If we're going to pick and choose, Donald Trump's a poster child for it, I guess. But there's a lot more we could be doing here.
I think you're right, Rachel, which is if you're among the Democratic faithful and you agree to prosecute Trump, then basically, you are giving into this base impulse. But we have a longstanding tradition, Roger, of basically not prosecuting our political opponents. So how should Democratic politicians think about this going forward? Because it's not just about Trump's tax returns. There are many opportunities in the future in order to go down this road. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think a lot of this is his own making, right? First off, he created this brand where he was proud of the fact that he paid such a low tax, and has basically gone about and kind of propagated that as part of his kind of cultural myth. Second is when, you can't just look at the New York AG and expect them to kind of stop an investigation that's already going. And
part of this is also that, he's cultivated some of this coverage. It's similar to the point that I made before. When you claim that a golf course should get a tax break because it's also kind of a goat farm and things like that. I don't know if these things are illegal, right? And we can debate whether or not they're wrong. But this is a situation that I think he has really brought about on his own. And it's also interesting because he was more than willing to at least call for and advocate for the prosecution of his political rivals. So I think he, in a sense, created kind of the moral justification for putting him under a microscope, because he continually called for his opponents to be put under a microscope.
Yeah, that is a fair point. All right, guys, stick with us. More with Team Rising right after this.